Well, good afternoon, everyone. I think it is afternoon, just 12 on the dot. So let me say, first of all, thank you all for joining the third in our series of events following the murder of George Floyd and the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement. I know we're not alone in having conversations like this. They're happening everywhere, it seems to me, and that is absolutely right and appropriate. It feels like it might be one of those moments when attention is so focused on an issue that we might be able to drive some real progress. There has to be a little bit of a silver lining somewhere, I think, in what has happened recently. It's a moment when we all need to do more to ensure that we're not just passive but active agents for change. And for the SRA, these events are one way for us to raise awareness, to hopefully inspire action, and to help bring about that change. So in the previous two webinars, we discussed the diversity of the profession. We've talked about the concerns about lack of progression for Black and Asian solicitors and the resulting low numbers at partner level in the biggest firms. In our last session, we talked about the great work that organisations such as Aspiring Solicitors and Rare Recruitment are doing to support firms in recruiting diverse talent. And both of those sessions have focused on really good practice tips and examples, and both are available on the website, if the SRA website, if you would like to see them now. I guess it's true to say from the SRA point of view that we've seen an awful lot of initiatives in the last period. We know that data collection is much better, engagement is much stronger, and there is undoubtedly a clear commitment and really importantly, a desire for change. But we still have more work to do to shift that dial. So today we wanted to take a look backwards. I know that sounds like an odd thing to do, but we want to reflect on the pace of change over the past 10 years, particularly since the Equality Act was put in place in 2010, because we think it would be helpful to think about what we have learned from the past so that we can apply it to the future. And of course, there have been other moments like this in the past, opportunities for real change, often as a result of personal tragedy, such as the murder of Stephen Lawrence in 1993 and the following Macpherson report. We need to learn from these as we respond to what happened to George Floyd. So I welcome you today and hope you'll participate in our discussion. We've already had some questions which we'll try and answer, but we invite you to send us more. So please log into your Google account, or you can email us at diversity@sra.org.uk. So let me introduce our panel. I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Lubna Shuja, who's the newly appointed Deputy Vice President of the Law Society and a long-standing member of the Sole Practitioners Group, and Dr. Zubaida Haq, who you may have seen on our TV screens, sharing her expertise on race and gender equality and indeed social justice. She's got a number of advisory roles, not least of which is on SAGE, so a view about this issue in relation to COVID perhaps, and is well known for her work at the Runnymede Trust. It's an honour to have both of you with us today. Thank you for your time and contributions. I know it's going to be a good conversation. And I wonder if I could begin by just asking you to introduce yourself and say a few introductory words. And perhaps I could start with you, Zubaida.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to be here. I hope you all had a good weekend and so on. This is a fantastic opportunity to talk about race, racism, racial discrimination, and to what extent we've made strides and achievements, particularly since the Macpherson report in 1999, which at the time was a watershed, if you like, in race relations and racial discrimination. My background is simply that I have been in the equality field for a very long time. I'm a researcher by nature. I worked for several government departments. I've worked for universities. I've worked for think tanks. My former role was interim director of the Runnymede Trust. And currently I am working for Independent, SAGE, the Scientific Advisory Group on Emergencies, looking at COVID and how we can address COVID, and trying to make science more transparent in relation to COVID, and also working with the Hamilton Commission, which is a commission that Lewis Hamilton set up to look at the issues in relation to diversity in motor racing. And I think I'll leave it there because I think Lubna, my colleague, has lots to say.
Thanks very much, Zubaida. Lubna.
Thank you. Can I first of all say thank you so much to you, Anna, and to the SRA for inviting me to come and speak, join the conversation on behalf of the Law Society on this really important topic. In relation to background, you've already indicated that I am the Deputy Vice President of the Law Society of England and Wales. I'm also a sole practitioner myself. I'm based in Birmingham, and my current practice is mainly a regulatory background. I sit as a chair for a number of disciplinary committees, professional conduct committees and fitness to practice panels. And today I'd like to focus on race equality within the legal profession and how that has changed over the last 10 years and what more needs to be done going forward.
Okay, great. So, so as I hope everyone who's listening, watching can hear, we have some great expertise available to us coming from different perspectives. And I'd like to start with you, Zubaida, and ask you what you think the most significant improvements have been since the passing of the Equality Act. So, where were we? Can we feel satisfied with the progress that we've made?
It's put me in an awkward spot, Anna, that you said, let's look at the significant improvements, because I think I'll be struggling to find those. I think I'd like to, if you don't mind, take a bit more of a step back to Macpherson report, where, if you like, was the beginnings of the Equality Act, and talk a little bit about the race equality duty as well as the Equality Act, and then ask that question about what kind of improvements have we made, and have we actually not made the substantive progress as we wanted to, and taken a few steps back. The 1999 Macpherson report, the Macpherson report was a huge watershed in terms of racial discrimination. Now, just for your audience, that report came out of, if you like, the brutal racist murder of Stephen Lawrence. We know that in the 1990s, the police had really botched that investigation, and subsequently, the Home Secretary Jack Straw had commissioned the Macpherson report. Now, the Macpherson report was a watershed because what it came out with was not only the notion, the really important idea that racism wasn't just about individuals, racism wasn't about bad apples, racism wasn't just about witting discrimination. Racism was about the unwitting processes, practices, and procedures, the institutional racism that contributes towards racial discrimination. And that was an extraordinary concept that came out at the time, because Black and ethnic minority groups knew that had existed, but it was very difficult to prove. It was very difficult to prove institutional racism. So in that sense, it was an extraordinary thing to come out. And to give the Labour government some credit at the beginning, that notion of institutional discrimination, but more to the point, the race equality duty, the public sector equality duty that came out of it, which basically said at the time that we needed to eliminate, that public authorities needed to eliminate unlawful racial discrimination, but also promote equality of opportunity and good relations. That subsequently became enacted in the Equality Act. All of that was great. That started to be rolled out into legislation. But what's happened since has not been, if you like, has not been the policy rolled into practice. What's happened since, and I'm going to start from 2010, Anna, is that the coalition government and the Conservative government have taken what was incredible strides in race relations and legislation in the Equality Act. They've taken that and they've undermined it. They have diluted the public sector equality duty. And we've seen that in austerity policies. We've seen that in hostile environment policies. And And we've seen that through the Windrush scandal. And really, it all started with David Cameron, when David Cameron made a speech at the CBI in 2012, where he said, and I'll say this very clearly, that he, on the one hand, said, look, the Equality Act is a great piece of legislation, or better still, he said, it's not a bad piece of legislation. But then he subsequently undermined it by saying, but caring about these things does not mean having to churn out reams of bureaucratic nonsense. We don't need all this extra tick box stuff. So today I am calling time on equality impact assessments. You no longer have to do these if these issues have been properly considered. What he meant by that is that if civil servants have properly considered them, then that's enough. And I'll stop there, Anna, because I can say a lot more about that. So I think I would argue that all the events and incidents since 2010 have suggested that not only have we not made progress in race equality and addressing racism, but to some extent we've gone backwards.
Yeah, and that's hugely disappointing because, as you rightly said, the Act was made some very bold statements about what we wanted to do, and what you're saying is that you don't see the evidence of that actually having been done, particularly in relation to process. I mean, is it your view that enough that the legislation as it stood would have been sufficient if we had enacted it, implemented it in all contexts in an appropriate way, or so one of the delegates has for today asking the question whether actually it was never going to be enough because there needed to be tougher penalties, more enforcement potential around the Act. Did it need to be stronger, or was it potentially strong enough? It's just the way that we've put it into practice, or not put it into practice, you're suggesting?
There's quite a lot to unpack there. I think to some extent one of your delegates is right to say that one of the reasons we haven't made as much stride in addressing race equality, racial discrimination, is because of the lack of enforcement for organisations and companies and institutions, including the police, which the Macpherson report, identified the police as one area which needed substantial reforming in terms of race relations. So that enforcement is an issue. Enforcement is an issue in terms of public sector equality duty, because to some extent you could argue that because of the lack of enforcement, because there's no real consequences if organisations and institutions aren't following through with their race equality duties, then companies can just ignore it, institutions can just ignore it. But I would argue that enforcement is actually just one of the issues. The other is exactly what Conservative government, the coalition government, have done since 2010, which is not only did they undermine the race equality duty, the public sector equality duty, by saying that, it creates more bureaucracy. They called it the red tape challenge. Not only did they undermine it that way, they also made it difficult to bring discrimination cases. They also reduced the budget of the very body, the Equality and Human Rights Commission. They reduced the budget and the independence of the organisation that was supposed to oversee the implementation of the public sector equality duty. And they also, crucially, stopped monitoring through equality impact assessments. So I would say it's all of that as well that's also undermined the public sector equality duty, and not just the lack of enforcement policies. Okay,
so Lubna, I'm really keen to know whether you think, notwithstanding that, in the context of the bold promise rather than the sort of the national implementation agenda, whether you think we've made progress in the legal profession in the last 10 years.
I think we have to acknowledge that there has definitely been some improvement in representation of Black, Asian and ethnic minority lawyers within the legal profession over the last 10 years. If you look at the data, back in 2012, 11% of solicitors identified as Black, Asian or ethnic minority. If you look at the data from 2017, that figure increased to 21%. But since 2017, we've actually had no change at all. So it's kind of gone up, and then it's kind of reached a static level where things have just kind of plateaued a little bit. Although the overall figure has increased, research that was done in 2018 indicated that some groups were less well represented. So, for example, only 3% of the profession are black solicitors, compared to over 15% who are Asian solicitors. Other areas where there has been some improvement is particularly in relation to solicitors and firms who are engaging on areas of race and inclusion, particularly in light of the more recent events around the Black Lives Matter movement. Now it's really quite a positive outcome to see more firms introducing increased race target settings and really focusing on this area in a way that they haven't done previously. Another change that we have seen is that previously there was reference to one homogenous group. So we used to hear about the, BAME solicitors, BAME lawyers, to identify all kind of solicitors that fell, or lawyers that fell within that category. Now there has been a shift to a more targeted approach, which focuses on particular ethnic groups. So, for example, whilst the experiences of Black and Asian lawyers will have many common features, they will also have their own unique experiences and their own unique challenges. And it's important that we recognise and address all of those. So it's good that those are real positive steps that have been taken. In terms of challenges, though, I mean, I think there are still a lot of challenges that we need to look at, consider, and try to address. More recently, we read, particularly in the legal press, about the Black solicitor who attended court and was mistaken, for want of a better word, for the defendant, and was asked on a number of occasions as she walked through the court, are you the defendant? Who's your representative? Where's your representative? I mean, that is just completely unacceptable in this day and age, that people have just automatically assumed that she was not a lawyer. And that's a real good example of unconscious bias at a very, very high level. Or rather, a widespread unconscious bias that needs to be addressed. The other issues that we still have that really we do need to try and look at is the underrepresentation of Black, Asian and ethnic minority solicitors at leadership level. And I know we've talked about this again and again, and I think, we just have to keep saying it because it's still not improving. At the moment, Black and Asian lawyers are very significantly underrepresented in firms which have 6 or more partners. So we categorise those as the mid to large size firms. When you start moving on to the larger firms, which are firms with 50 plus partners, the figures are quite stark because they have got the lowest proportion of Black and Asian and ethnic minority partners. Only 8% of very large firms have partners that are from those backgrounds, and that figure has not changed since 2017.
So I want to come back to a couple of points in particular that you've raised there. So the sort of unconscious bias cultural question and the underrepresentation at senior levels. But before I do, I mean, what sort of what you're painting a picture there of is, in answer to the question, have we made progress? Is kind of, well, some and some, not quite as bleak as you were suggesting, Zubaida. Some progress, but not perhaps as much as we would have anticipated looking forward if we were sitting now in 2010. And I guess about Zubaida, I'm interested to know what you think we should take away from that lesson of what happened after 2010. I mean, barring the fact that, political events, but what should we take away in practical terms to try to make the best we can of the situation we find ourselves in right now?
I think Lubna is absolutely right to point out that the progress in terms of collecting data and disaggregated data about the diversity in your workforce, including the BME diversity, is absolutely crucial. And one thing I didn't mention, but is important to acknowledge, is the race disparity audit. The race disparity unit set up by Theresa May actually is one of the more positive aspects of her legacy, because that, I think, links to the point that Lubna was making, which is it is crucial to have data. It's crucial to have data about diversity, about Black and ethnic minority people in your workforce, so you can see not only to what extent you are recruiting BME people, but also their retention and progress in the labour market, which is really, really important, because retention and progress is also about the culture of organisation, which is something arguably that we haven't addressed as well. So I think in that sense, they are really important issues. I think what I'm more uncomfortable with, as someone who has worked in equality for a long time, is the fact that the narrative on racial discrimination, on racial inequality, even gender inequality, has moved from, if you like, institutional racism, institutional barriers, to personal responsibility, to notions of unconscious bias, and more emphasis on diversity policies. And I want to make it absolutely clear that diversity is absolutely critical and representation is critical, but neither are the equivalent of equality. That you can have a lot of diversity in an organisation, it doesn't mean that there is equality throughout the organisation, because you can have diversity all at the bottom. You could have all your cleaners. You could have all your cleaners who are BME or from or women, or lots of people in insecure jobs that are women or BME. But then at the top, it's still, if you like, the sort of white middle class peaks that we've always had. So I think we really need to sort of challenge some of those notions. And I believe that race equality and gender equality to some extent, almost equality, really moved from being issues about institutional responsibility to now issues about personal responsibility and unconscious bias, which is not the sum of the reasons for inequality at the moment.
Okay, so let's perhaps focus on that institutional responsibility and start perhaps with the point you were making, Lubna, about people at the top of organisations, that leadership question, diversity, not just in the numbers, as you say, is about it, but across the spectrum of roles in an organisation. As Lubna said, we have significant issues in that respect in the legal profession. In your experience, in your kind of experience from other sectors more generally, is there anything that sort of some other organisations or other sectors have done to be really successful in this space of boosting diversity at the top of organisations? Zubaida? You're on mute. Sorry,
I thought that question was for Lubna. Could you just repeat that question?
So I'm just wondering if in what you've seen across in other sectors, in other places, has anyone sort of really got this right? This kind of diversity at the top of organisations, and if so, what are the lessons we might learn? Who's doing it better than us?
Oh, that's such a difficult question. It's a question I've always struggled with, because different organisations do different things. So I don't know if I could easily say there is an organisation or an institution that does it, better than anybody else. Even arguably, the EHRC has come under criticism recently for not having any Black commissioners up until recently. So it is a very difficult question. What we do know is it's the organisations that start with the data even before they're asked to produce the data. The organizations that are looking at whether there is equal pay, whether there is diversity in terms of promotion, whether there is diversity in terms of recruitment, really starting to ask those questions, but also the organizations that are regularly asking their employees as well about what their experiences are within that force. Because what we know is the issue nowadays is recruitment is still, diversity in recruitment is still a massive issue, but actually that's just one of the issues. The bigger issues are around progression and retention. And those require organizations and institutions to monitor. And that's where organizations really fall. The other things I think is, and Lubna sort of hinted at this, is around targets and organizations that set up targets, and not necessarily quotas. Quotas are illegal, but targets certain. If you have diversity targets, if you have race equality targets, if you have gender equality targets, then what that does is that forces middle managers, and middle managers are really crucial here because to some extent they are the bottlenecks they are the, sort of some of the barriers for people not progressing. It's the middle managers, it's not necessarily the people at the top. If you have targets and performance related pay that are linked to those targets around diversity, it forces managers to look for Black and ethnic minority groups, for women, for disabled groups, for LGBT groups in areas that they wouldn't ordinarily look. It forces them to have more outreach, better outreach with their adverts and so on. So that's what we know. We know what practices work and are good, but that doesn't mean that there's a limit. But we don't. It's very difficult to identify a single institution or an organisation that is at the best. Although I'm sure the SRA are well on their way.
I don't know. We try, but I'm trying is part of what you're talking about. Try sort of being, in everything you do, in all the decisions you make, asking yourself a question about how you need to play diversity into that is part of that, isn't it? I mean, Lubna, if you thinking about this moment in time, what do you think that the legal sector could do to really seize the opportunity and lead the way in relation to some of these questions?
Thanks, Anna. I mean, I think it's worth pointing out that some steps are already being taken. In July 2020, we heard about a number of magic circle firms who were discussing what they call their stay gap. So they were looking at where Black, Asian and ethnic minority lawyers were leaving the firm much earlier than their white colleagues were doing. So one of the figures that was quoted was that Black lawyers were leaving about 2.5 years earlier than their white colleagues were doing. So that clearly is indicative that there is a problem within those firms that needs to be tackled. Mm-hmm. I think, as Zubaida has mentioned, this is an issue around senior leadership. They are absolutely key. They are in a position where they can consider and analyse data. They are in a position where they can collate that data. And I think it's about, they need to talk to their ethnic minority colleagues. They need to find out what their experiences are. They've got to build trust with them. They've got to find out what are the obstacles that those people are coming across in order to progress with their careers. So it's really important, get the decision makers, get the managers, get the recruiters on board so that they are part of the dialogue and the discussion. The other thing that many law firms could do is to talk to other law firms, actually. Find out what they're doing better than what you're doing and learn from them. Share best practice. The Law Society does hold diversity and inclusion roundtables which are confidential, they're private, and they will bring together members of certain sectors within the profession, similar type firms, so that they can sit down and talk to each other and look at, pool data, pool diversity data, look at how others are dealing with issues that are coming up, look at what they can do better, and sometimes just look at how they are doing in relation to their colleagues and competitors. That in itself can be a driver for change. If they see that other people are doing things better, it will make them think, well, hang on a minute, they're doing it. Why aren't we doing it? If they can do it, we should be doing that. So that's one thing. Another thing that's a really valuable tool that can be used is what we call reverse mentoring, which I'm sure many people have heard a great deal about. That's proved to be very successful with promoting inclusion. So that's where you get a Black or an Asian or an ethnic minority solicitor who mentors a senior white colleague within the organisation and vice versa. So they both learn from each other and they both share experiences. So that's another thing. It's absolutely critical that senior leaders within organisations have to engage and support their ethnic minority colleagues. I see Zubayda's got a hand up, so I'll pass over to her. Clearly chomping at the bit to come in with something here.
Because you mentioned so many great things, Lubna. It's fantastic. What Lubna has mentioned that's really, really important is not only looking at other organizations to see if you can learn from them, and that's really critical. Looking around beyond your own little bubble to see what else is happening elsewhere. But it also raises the issue of policies and practices that may not be directly to do with race and racial discrimination, but maybe to do with the fact that actually those policies and practices are indirectly discriminating against different groups. And we certainly know that in relation to women. We know that the legal profession hasn't been brilliant until recently in terms of recruiting women, but also recruiting women at senior leadership positions. Now, one of the reasons for that has been, of course, the historical crippling hours. The sort of hours that haven't been 9 to 5, but have been extended hours. We also know from research, I carried out research a few years ago with approximately 30 young Black men in tech and construction industries. And what we learned from that is that it's also about the sort of external work practices, like going to the pub, like doing sports outside of work. It's also all of those informal practices unwittingly discriminate against, particular groups, against Muslim women, as well as people who have family lives and so on. And so it's not just about looking at your policies, monitoring your policies and practices that have a direct impact, if you like, on racism and racial discrimination. It's also looking at all of your practices and asking that question: are they discriminating against any group? And that's why, Anna, go back to your very first question, to the fact that the Conservative government diluted equality impact assessment has had a fundamental, devastating impact on racial discrimination, on being able to address racial discrimination and race equality.
But perhaps sort of at a more micro level, a really good example of ways in which, as we're making decisions about the management of firms or indeed about regulation, constantly asking yourself the question: could this have an impact on diversity, and if so, what and how could we ensure that we don't have that detrimental consequence? That sort of local small scale impact assessment is really critical to the decisions that are made by the leaders of a firm, is I think what you're saying, and certainly in our experience at the SRA, we would do those kind of equality impact assessments about the decisions that we're taking in regulatory space, but there's a management space for that as well, isn't there?
Yes, well, absolutely, and it's also an understanding a bit more about your employees, you know, whether it's women or Black and ethnic minority people. I mean, one of the things we know is that BME are 2 times more likely to be in poverty than their white counterparts. Now, the real life consequences of that is that sometimes people have to take more than one job in order to survive. And especially if you're a new recruit, if you're a junior recruit, you know, you're not on a high salary, it might mean that you actually working at the firm during the day is one of your jobs, and in the evening you're having to work elsewhere, whether it's in a restaurant or whether it's elsewhere, just to bring in more money. We know certainly that you know, Black women who Black women are much more likely to have to do that. I mean, there are consequences to poverty. Now, for an employer, they have to ask themselves the question about, for my employees, you know, what else is going on in their lives that prevents them from progressing at work? You know, can I do something about that? You know, is it pay? Is it insecure contracts? Insecure contracts has a massive impact on employees in terms of them even being able to, you know, not only rent homes, but, you know, pay phone bills and so on. All of these issues will have an impact on whether BME employees, whether you can recruit BME employees, but more significantly, whether you manage to retain your BME employees.
Yeah, and I mean, Lubna, in the legal profession, that intersection between race and class or social position, how does that play out in your experience?
Well, I think we've got to look at sort of culture changes within organisations. You know, class is very much linked to you know, how organisations are culturally, how they view things culturally. So it's about making some real changes at the heart of organisations. I mean, there's no point in having equality, diversity and inclusion policies on paper if you're not actually implementing them, or you can see that they're not actually working properly. You know, there are lots of ways to try and make a shift within an organisation. And I think that's what firms have really got to do. The Law Society recently has been undertaking over the last 2 or 3 months a piece of research around the experiences of Black, Asian and ethnic minority solicitors within the profession. And the findings of that research are due to be announced actually on Wednesday this week. It's a bit unfortunate that I didn't have the figures ready today, because I would have quite liked to have been able to talk about that in a little bit more detail. But we're launching it's called the Race for Inclusion, Findings Race for Inclusion, on Wednesday at 4 o'clock. Free session, and people can register on the Law Society website to hear more about that. But speaking more generally, you know, I think organisations have to look at, you know, which parts of their own organisation can they broaden the talent pool. You know, look at parts of your organisation and look at why have you not got, you know, a good diverse representation within that area. You know, start a forum for any Black and ethnic minority staff members that you have got, so that you can talk to them about what their experiences are and find out from them what issues they are experiencing, so that you can look at making culture changes within the organisation. So I think it's really about making a real culture shift, because that's the only way you're going to address these inequalities, really.
And I mean, thinking about your organisation, the Law Society, and the organisation I chair, the SRA, so the regulator and the representative body, we require firms and solicitors to do more than comply with the rules in this space. So we do expect that good practice to be considered and thought through, and I think that's a really important junction, isn't it, between our role as a regulator and your role as the Law Society, just as you've described, shining a light on some of the things that people are particularly doing, which suggest some ways forward in that respect. But the regulator can't change what are often really deep-rooted cultural, external sort of factors. You know, the law operates in this kind of much broader context, don't we? And structural inequalities in society are not something that we can directly address. We have to work within them, and we can sort of have a little microclimate of change in the legal profession. So Lubna, what do you think the kind of 3 key strategic things are that we should be doing in this space?
I think it's about providing the space and the tools for firms to be able to do better effectively. Arranging workshops, like this, webinars like this, where we're talking about the subject, so that at least we're talking about it. Arrange workshops where you invite firms to come along to talk about race inclusion, to talk to them about how they can train their staff, particularly senior leaders within their organizations. We need to have much more training. I think I've mentioned this already, around conscious and unconscious bias, which many people are not aware of. That's part and parcel of trying to achieve change. Perhaps, encouraging our firms to use diversity calendars, so that they mark religious and cultural events and festivals, such as Black History Month, understanding about Ramadan and when it's taking place. It's really about making the dialogue a lot more wider and making it more relevant to them on a day-to-day basis, so that they really understand that they need to represent Black and ethnic minority solicitors. We often see firms that don't have any representation within their communications. You look at their website, nothing on their website. Look at images that they might have within other social media communication, nothing on there. And that's something they really need to give a lot of thought to. So I think it's about providing tools as best we can, and guidance to help them along that journey.
What would you say to that, Zubaida? What's on your list?
I certainly support what Lubna's saying about taking action on that level. I'm more nervous that companies will do, and institutions will do, what they've always done, which is have sort of ad hoc, incremental, piecemeal changes, bring in a diversity trainer for the day to address unconscious bias, and think that that's enough. Think that little actions, piecemeal actions here and there is enough. And the argument that was made by the Macpherson report was, of course, a really important point that actually, no, race and racial discrimination is a result of institutional practices. It is a result of witting and unwitting policies, practices, and procedures. And that's really important to understand, that diversity trainers are not going to change that. I mean, one of the issues I have, or if you like, the bugbears I have about unconscious racism, and this bugbear comes from research, that actually unconscious bias it raises awareness. It raises awareness of what people's unconscious biases are, and that's important. Stereotypes are, greatly to do with conscious bias, but it doesn't change behavior. And we know this from really robust research that's been carried out from unconscious bias, that because it doesn't change behavior, and actually sometimes it can even have a counterproductive impact, we need to go much deeper than that. We do need to have policies, practices, and procedures that can wittingly and unwittingly discriminate against groups. And we know that from government policies, but we also know that from institutional policies. The other thing I would say, Anna, which may be a little provocative, is that I think it's not that organisations and institutions shouldn't get complacent and say, well, how much can we do, when actually a lot of this is societal problems. Because actually employers could make a massive difference to what happens in society. It's not an accident. And I know this is a bit this might be a bit of a stretch. But the reason Black and ethnic minority people have been more at risk of being infected with, hospitalized and die with COVID-19, part of the reason is to do with their socioeconomic status. And their socioeconomic status is linked to their employment outcomes, linked to their employment experience. And we know that BME groups are much more likely to be on insecure contracts, on 0-hour contracts, because of the color of their skin. So it's all linked. And in that sense, how employers treat their BME employers has an impact on BME people beyond the workspace.
Oh, that's a point very well made. Of course, it's one of the places we spend huge amounts of time in our workplace if we're fortunate enough to be able to go there. But we do spend huge amounts of time with colleagues in a working environment, and of course, you're absolutely right. We take away from that what we've learnt about people, and it changes the way we behave. So given that. Perhaps also provocatively, I wonder if you can give me a sense of how you would judge that a firm was doing more than, to use David Cameron's phrase, ticking the boxes. So more than a bit of diversity training or whatever. Actually challenging the processes, the practices, the procedures, building in diversity from the inside out of the firm to change the experience that people have and the behaviour that they see around them. How would you recognise that? What does it look like?
What does it look like? Well, I think to some extent you've answered that question, Anna. It is that proactive equality impact assessment, where you ask that question of every practice, policy, and procedure that you have, and asking that question, does this policy have a detrimental impact on any particular group? And unless you ask that question, you won't know. And we know that, once again, going back to COVID, we know that if you don't collect data about anything, about a particular issue, about a policy, then it's basically as though that a problem doesn't exist, because it's only data that can tell us whether that problem exists. Now, data can come in all sorts of forms. Data can come in, just collecting numbers about who you're recruiting, what their position is, to what extent, how often they're progressing in their work. Are you retaining them? Do they leave early or not? As you've suggested, Lubna, there's that kind of data, but there's also data in terms of regular surveys with your employees and asking them questions about their well-being, their welfare, how they're treated on a daily basis, everything, because that's how you find out if problems exist. You don't wait for the problems to arise, but arguably, by the time problems have arisen, it's too late. It's always too late. So I think that's one of the ways you would know that an organisation is doing well. But it is really important. I'd just like to give another example of how we found out that certain policies have been discriminating against groups of people. Several years ago, the Runnymede Trust, which I was an interim director of recently, we carried out research with over 1,000 Black and ethnic minority teachers in this country. Now, that's the biggest research study with BME teachers in this country. And we were essentially looking at their employment experiences. And what was really interesting, one of the most interesting findings, was when we were talking about performance-related pay. What came across, and this particularly came across from Black teachers more than any other group, and we have to recognise that anti-Black racism is particularly strong. It is a particularly pernicious form of racism in this country. What came across was that Black teachers, on average, were given responsibility for leading and teaching groups that were considered to be more troublesome because of stereotypes about Black teachers, and because of stereotypes about problematic children. And so they were given that responsibility. But guess what? When it came to performance-related pay, that wasn't measured. What was measured in performance-related pay was if you were in charge of the high-achieving maths class or a high-achieving, English class and so on. But they weren't being given responsibility, and they weren't being given those tasks. They were being given tasks that were not being measured. Now, I know, and we all know that that's happening on a daily basis across institutions, because that's based on stereotypes about what people can and cannot do, about their intelligence levels, about all sorts of issues around their achievements, and so on. And now that needs to be addressed, and that means looking at also how you measure performance-related pay. So sorry, that is not completely answering your question, but it goes back to the fact that it's a thorough equality impact assessment of everything, really.
Well, I think you're arguing fundamentally for a systemic approach, out of which will flow lots of specifics, which will can then be sort of used as illustrations to others about some of the things that you can do. But it's not enough to just repeat or sort of recast what other people have done. You need the systemic approach that sits around it for it to be truly successful. Is I think the case you're making, and I think it's case well made, and of course the other point you're making is about data, and that ultimately what's counted is what matters, and that's the case. I mean, we know that's the case in so many instances, don't we? Yes. That if it's not counted, it's irrelevant, and if it's counted, that's what people will be focused on. So data hugely important.
Can I add one more thing, Anna? Sorry, do you mind? Which is that if there's anything we've learned from the last 10 years, whether it's on a government level or just generally through, race discrimination within institutions, is that discrimination can occur not only through intentional acts, but also failing to monitor and address discrimination. So this is one of the arguments that the Conservative government used in relation to the Windrush scandal. They argued, well, we never intended to discriminate against British black residents. That wasn't the point. This goes back to the 1975 Race Relations Act, which is, it's not just about intention, it's also about the unintended or indirect, unintended discrimination, indirect discrimination. And of course, this was mentioned once again through, if you like, the Macpherson report, and sort of comes out a little bit in the Equality Act as well, which is, it is also about failing to act. And that's why the Equality Act talked about promoting, race equality. And that's why it had a race equality duty. It has a public sector equality duty. And I think that's a fundamental point that we need to sort of go back to, which is that discrimination can occur through not monitoring and through failing to act as well as acting.
So systemic approaches, data collection, monitoring, all these things, I fear that they sound quite scary to some of the people who are part of the sole practitioners group, Lubna, because these are big exercises in small businesses with very low margins and limited time. So I wonder what you think about how you turn some of those messages into something which is manageable and doable for us in a small firm environment, which after all is the bulk of the legal profession, and actually where an awful lot of lawyers from Black and Asian backgrounds find themselves working.
Yes, yeah, very, very high proportion. I think it's 36% of lawyers are found in Black, Asian or ethnic minority sort of sole practitioner type firms. I think there are lots of kind of quite practical things that people can start doing and looking at. And we've got to look at, first of all, getting the right people into the profession to start off with, attracting diverse talent from the very outset. That can happen by making sure that you are offering vacation schemes and training contracts specifically for candidates that are from Black, Asian and ethnic minority backgrounds. Making sure that you engage with Black, Asian and ethnic minority type societies within universities. So you are targeting them while they're still studying effectively and raising awareness at that level. And there are many other diversity organisations that can be approached as well. I've already made reference to tailoring communications to make sure that diversity, you've shown that diversity is essential to your business, because actually many candidates will look at a firm's diversity and inclusion policies. They'll have a look to see, what is where do you stand on it, before they will decide whether they want to apply to your firm for any kind of job. The other thing that can be done, if you're using recruitment agencies, set them an explicit target. So tell them explicitly that you want a diverse range of candidates to be put forward. And when you do get the applications coming in, use blind recruitment methods. So in order to minimise unconscious bias, remove names, remove locations, remove the university that they might have attended, because that will really hopefully focus in on the merits of the candidate rather than anything that could prevent them from moving on. Once you get those candidates into the firms, there's a whole raft of things that you can do to make sure that they stay there, because one of the issues we've got is they get in, but then they don't stay. They move on because they're not happy once they get there. So I've already talked about reverse mentoring. That's a very, very simple, straightforward thing that can be done. I've already talked about forums for Black, Asian and ethnic minority staff, so that they feel that they are listened to and they feel that they can air any thoughts or ideas that they've got. Regular training is essential, because no matter how often we get trained, and I personally attend training, honestly, several times a year with several different regulators, and every time I go, I learn something new, or it will remind me of something that I think, oh gosh, yes, need to bring that back to the forefront of my mind. So regular training to reinforce, to challenge is a really good good thing to do within your practice. And also making sure that social activities that take place within your firm are inclusive. Not everybody drinks alcohol, not everybody plays golf or has ever played golf. You've got to think about what is accessible to a much wider, diverse range of staff members. And then, of course, we've talked already about promotion, because once they get there, they're not going to stay there unless they can see that there is some prospect of moving on within the firm. And what I would say is be that person that calls out unfair promotion practices. Be the ally of Black, ethnic, minority and Asian colleagues. Be their voice in places where their voices may not be heard or cannot be heard. So, white colleagues can become allies. They can do a great deal at senior leadership levels to make sure that they are promoting talent progressing. And also, have some kind of targets around work allocation, because often promotion is linked to work allocation, and satisfaction levels are also allocated to work. Satisfaction levels are also linked to work allocation. I have spoken to a number, many Black, Asian and ethnic minority colleagues who will say to me, do you know what, I got passed over for that job. It was given to, and it will be a white colleague, or a client has not been allocated to them, and it's been given to another white colleague. You need to make sure that's not happening. Address that. Do something about it. And actually, Zubaydah was talking about how we can put bonuses and that kind of thing in place. Make managers have a bonus that is directly related to recruiting Black and ethnic minority lawyers within the firm to senior levels, so that it is at the forefront of their mind. They're thinking about it constantly, and discussion around representation of Black, Asian and ethnic minorities lawyers at senior levels has to become part of the appraisal process for senior leaders within the firm. So I think there's lots and lots of things that can be done on a very practical level.
Okay, well, that's a great list, and you've taken us almost up to time, Lubna. Just a couple of closing remarks, I think. I was going to invite you both to tell me where you'd like the legal profession to be in 10 years' time, and we haven't got time for that, but I think we definitely need to be much further ahead than we got in this last 10-year period, if you like. The distance between 2010 and 2020, we need to make more of it. Between 2020 and 2030, we need to be in a much better place. And I suppose one of the things lots of lessons, lots of thoughts, but one of the things that I would take away from this conversation is the notion that, impact assessments are not just for big policy initiatives. Impact assessments are for every day, actually, in every way, all the things that we do and the consequences that they might have critically important. So just a couple of things to finish off quickly. First of all, that if you want to stay involved in this work, and I hope that you do, that you've heard something inspiring today, we'd love to hear from you at the SRA. We all need to work together across the profession if we're going to make a significant difference, which is why we work with the Law Society very closely. We'll be looking very closely at the work that they publish, as Lubna says, later on in the week. We'll be publishing our own operational report on the diversity profile of solicitors in our enforcement processes in the middle of December. I think we are expecting, just as it did 15 years ago, that it will show that there is an overrepresentation of both men and Black people in the enforcement process, and we're committed to doing some further research to try and understand that, to get under the statistics and understand why that might be the case. But there's a lot more for us to do. That's absolutely clear, and I'm looking forward to working with you all on that over the course of the next year and beyond. I'm really honoured to have chaired these events, and I just like to name check some of the people we've had apart from those in the room today. So first of all, to Zubaida and Lubna, thank you very much for joining us and for giving us your insight. I'd also like to thank Paulette Mastin, Sam Smethers, John Oladay, Chris White and Rafe Mercedes. And finally to say, well, we probably won't see each other again before Christmas and most importantly, the new year. Let's hope it's a better one for everyone. And thank you again for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.